The patrol stepped off just after first light, the way hundreds of others had before it. Same valley, same dust, same low mud walls stitched into the terrain like they'd always been there. The compound was listed as abandoned. It had been flagged weeks earlier, watched from the air, checked against movement reports, written off as empty. Nothing unusual. Another box to clear, another structure to walk through and leave behind. When the first man crossed the threshold, he noticed the floor beneath his boot wasn't cold. It was warm, not sun-warmed, not residual heat from the day. Warm in the way a room is warm when someone has just stood there. That was the first thing that didn't fit. And it wasn't the last. The unit was operating in eastern Afghanistan, in a stretch of farmland broken by irrigation ditches and low compounds built from packed earth and stone. The kind of terrain where visibility collapses once you're inside the walls. From the air, everything looks still. On the ground, nothing ever really is. The platoon had been rotating through that area for months. They knew which compounds were occupied, which ones were seasonal, which ones had been abandoned after fighting, moved on. This one had been empty on paper for over 3 weeks. No foot traffic, no vehicle tracks, no heat signatures on the drone feeds at night. No reason to think anyone had been inside. The patrol leader that day was a staff sergeant with 2 deployments already behind him. He'd cleared enough buildings that the routine ran on muscle memory. Outer wall, entry point, left-right clear, corners first, ceiling second, floor last. He said later that nothing felt wrong when they approached. No dogs, no cooking smoke, no sound. The compound sat quiet, doors hanging loose. The courtyard opened to the sky. It wasn't until they stepped inside the main structure that the details began to stack. The floor was warm across the entire room, not just near the entrance. Packed dirt, smooth from years of use, holding heat evenly, the way it does when bodies have been moving across it. One of the soldiers dropped to a knee, pressing his palm flat against the ground. He kept it there longer than necessary. He didn't say anything at first. In the corner was a cooking surface, a simple clay stove built into the wall. No fire, no embers, but the stone around it was warm to the touch. Not hot, not cooling down, just warm, as if the fire had been put out minutes earlier. They checked the adjacent rooms. Same thing. Warm floors, warm walls in places where people would lean or sit. Bedding laid out, thin blankets folded, still holding shape. Not dusty, not disturbed, just unused, in a way that suggested very recent absence. They cleared the entire compound in under 10 minutes. No occupants, no hidden spaces, no tunnel entrances, no tracks leading away from the walls. The ground outside was dry and hard, perfect for footprints. There were none. The staff sergeant called it up. The report was straightforward. Possible recent occupation. No contact, no movement observed. They held security while Hire decided whether to escalate. A drone feed was pulled up. The same drone that had been watching the area intermittently for days. No movement recorded before the patrol entered, none after. The timestamps didn't lie. The compound had been empty until it wasn't, or maybe until it always was. That's where explanations usually start. Residual heat, thermal retention, sun exposure, but the patrol had entered from the shaded side. The sun hadn't reached the interior yet, and the warmth wasn't uneven. It wasn't concentrated where sunlight would fall. It was everywhere people would be. One of the younger soldiers joked that maybe the place was haunted. Nobody laughed. Not because they were scared, because it didn't feel like a joke fit the moment. They finished the clearance, marked the compound, and moved on. That should have been the end of it. Just another strange detail filed away under stress and fatigue. But later that evening, back at the patrol base, the same details came up again. Quietly, between mouthfuls of food, between cleaning weapons, another squad leader mentioned a similar compound a week earlier. Different grid, same warmth, same lack of tracks, same drone coverage showing nothing. Then someone else added that they'd felt it too, months back, on a night clearance, a room that smelled lived in, tea still warm in cups. No one there. None of these stories had made it into formal reports. There wasn't a category for them. They lived in conversations instead, in pauses, in the way someone would stop mid-sentence, then shake their head and move on. The staff sergeant didn't push it. He'd learned that war produces enough strange sensations without borrowing trouble from the unexplained. Lack of sleep, adrenaline, pattern-seeking brains under pressure. Still, when he lay down that night, he found himself thinking about the floor, about how evenly warm it had been, about how it felt under his hand. Compounds cool quickly in that climate. He knew that. Everyone did. And yet, by the next morning, the patrol moved back through the area. The compound was cold, stone cold. The warmth was gone. No new tracks. No sign anyone had returned. Just a structure sitting quietly in the dust, as abandoned as it had always been. The story might have stayed there if it hadn't been for how often it repeated. Different units, different years, same detail, warmth without presence, evidence without cause. Some of the older local interpreters had their own explanations. They spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't sound foolish to foreign ears. They talked about places that remember people, about land that holds on to what passed through it. The soldiers listened politely, then went back to their routines. Because in war, you learn quickly which questions can be asked and which ones don't help you do your job. Still, once you've stepped into a room that feels occupied when it shouldn't be, it's hard not to carry that feeling with you. It lingers, like heat in a floor, long after the fire should be out. After that patrol, the staff sergeant started paying closer attention when similar stories came up, not interrogating anyone, not pushing for details, just listening when someone mentioned a clearance that didn't sit right. Over time, a pattern began to take shape, not formally, not in any report, but in the quiet overlap between accounts. Most of them happened during daylight. That surprised him. Night operations come with built-in explanations, shadows, fatigue, the way your depth perception collapses under nods and moonlight. But these were mid-morning clearances. Sun already up, visibility good. Men rested enough to trust their senses. One account came from a different company rotating through the same province the year before. Their platoon had been tasked with checking a cluster of compounds near an old canal. The area had been depopulated after a series of IED strikes. Drone coverage showed nothing for weeks. Locals avoided it entirely. They entered the first compound and found nothing unusual. Cold floors, dust settled thick enough to leave clear prints, exactly what you'd expect. The second compound was different. The point man said the air felt heavier inside. Not humid, just held, like the room had been sealed and recently opened. He didn't use the word warm at first. He said it felt used, That was the word he kept coming back to. The floors were warm there too. The walls, especially near the sitting area, carried heat. A kettle sat on the stove, empty, but still warm enough that one of the soldiers reflexively pulled his hand back. They checked for embers. Nothing. The stove was clean. No ash. No smell of smoke. Outside, the canal bank showed no disturbance. The mud was undisturbed, smooth from drying in the sun. No tracks leading in. No tracks leading out. They held the compound for nearly an hour waiting on guidance. During that time, nothing changed. No movement. No sounds. The warmth stayed consistent, as if the building itself was generating it. When they left and returned, later that afternoon with another element, the warmth was gone. Everything had equalized. The place felt like every other abandoned structure they'd seen. That detail came up again and again. The warmth never lingered once the area was secured and left alone. It was always present on first contact, never on return. Some tried to frame it as a thermal anomaly, heat trapped in thick walls, microclimate effects. That explanation worked on paper until you compared notes. These compounds weren't identical. Different materials, different exposure, different layouts. The only consistent variable was human presence, except there wasn't any. One medic recalled a clearance during his first deployment years earlier. Southern Iraq, near the marshlands. A series of reed and mud structures along a river bend. They were supposed to be empty. The area had been evacuated after heavy fighting. He remembered kneeling to treat a cut on another soldier's hand and noticing the ground beneath them was warm and dry, despite the damp air. He remembered thinking how strange it was that the bedding they found inside felt recently slept in, not rumpled, just warm. At the time, he wrote it off. Stress does strange things to perception. But when he heard others describe the same thing, years later, in different countries, it bothered him. Not because it felt supernatural, because it felt specific. The staff sergeant eventually mentioned one of these stories to an intelligence officer he trusted, someone who'd been around long enough to have heard things without immediately dismissing them. The officer listened, nodded, and said something that stuck. "Every war has places like that," he said. "Rooms that don't let go." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Historically, there were precedents. Old forward positions, reused across conflicts. Bunkers from one war reopened in another. Villages abandoned and resettled, over and over, until the timeline blurs. Layers of occupation compressed into a single space. In some cultures, those places are marked, avoided, given names that translate poorly into English. Not haunted exactly, more like occupied by memory. That explanation satisfied some people. It gave the experience context without demanding belief. Others weren't interested. For them, it was just another strange footnote in an already overwhelming environment. But what unsettled the staff sergeant wasn't the idea of memory or land holding on to the past. It was the operational contradiction. Modern surveillance is thorough, persistent, unforgiving. If someone enters or exits a compound, there's usually a trace, a heat bloom, a shadow, a delay in the feed. In these cases, there was nothing. No movement before, no movement after, no sign of people leaving in a hurry or hiding nearby, no evidence of a mistake in timing. The warmth suggested presence within minutes of entry. The surveillance contradicted it completely. At some point, you're left with two possibilities. Either multiple trained soldiers across different units and years misinterpreted the same sensations in the same way, or something about those spaces didn't align with the data. Most chose the first option. It was safer, more controllable. But late at night, when the base went quiet and the generators dropped to a low hum, the staff sergeant found himself replaying those entries in his head. The way the rooms felt before anyone spoke. The way no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Warm. That word carried weight it didn't deserve. He started to notice how often soldiers described absence using physical sensations. Cold when it should be warm, warm when it should be cold. Silence that felt active, stillness that pressed back. Maybe that was just how the mind coped with environments shaped by violence and displacement. Maybe the brain fills in gaps when certainty disappears. Or maybe some places really do hold on to more than they should. The compound from that first patrol was eventually destroyed, collapsed as part of a route-clearing operation, reduced to rubble and dust. The warmth never appeared again, but neither did an explanation. Years later, after he'd rotated home and the deployment had settled into something resembling memory, the staff sergeant found that the compound still surfaced in his thoughts at unexpected times, not as fear, not even as confusion, more like an unresolved detail that refused to be filed away. He'd be standing in a hardware store, hand resting on a concrete floor, feeling the temperature through his palm, and the thought would surface without warning. Or he'd wake up early, before dawn, and remember how quiet the courtyard had been that morning, how ordinary it all looked from the outside. He eventually spoke about it with a former platoon mate over coffee, someone who'd been there, someone who wouldn't brush it off or try to dress it up. The other man listened, nodded once and said, "I remember thinking we were late." Late for what? Neither of them could say. That was another detail that appeared across accounts. A sense of interruption, not pursuit, not danger, just the feeling of arriving moments after something had concluded, like walking into a room where a conversation had just ended and the words were still hanging in the air. The staff sergeant later learned that local villagers had refused to use that compound long before U.S. forces ever arrived, not because of any specific incident, but because it had been used repeatedly, over generations, as shelter, as a meeting place, as a staging point during earlier conflicts. It had changed hands so many times that no single family claimed it anymore. It wasn't cursed, it was worn thin. That idea stayed with him. In military history, there are locations that appear again and again, hills retaken at enormous cost, crossroads fought over by different armies decades apart, buildings repurposed so many times that their original purpose dissolves. Those places accumulate more than damage. They accumulate intent, fear, routine, waiting. When people talk about the psychological toll of war, they usually focus on individuals. But there's another layer that rarely gets discussed. The way certain spaces begin to feel conditioned by what's happened inside them, not haunted in the way movies suggest, not occupied by anything that can be seen or named, just shaped. During a training exercise stateside, the staff sergeant mentioned the compound to a senior NCO who'd served in Bosnia in the 1990s. The man didn't interrupt, didn't challenge the details. He just said that they'd cleared houses after ceasefires where the stoves were warm and the radios were still humming, even though the occupants were long gone. Sometimes people leave fast, he said. Sometimes places don't. That was the closest thing to an answer anyone ever offered. There were, of course, rational explanations that still held weight. Thermal mass behaves unpredictably. Thick earthen walls can retain heat longer than expected. Stress and expectation can prime perception. When you're trained to look for danger, your senses sharpen in ways that aren't always precise. The staff sergeant accepted all of that. What he didn't accept was how consistently the warmth appeared where people would have been sitting, sleeping, cooking, not in corners, not randomly, always in the human spaces, and how consistently it disappeared once those spaces were acknowledged, secured, and left behind. If it were just his experience, he might have dismissed it entirely. But it wasn't. It belonged to a quiet archive of shared moments that never made it into official histories. Stories traded between people who had no incentive to exaggerate them. As the years passed, he noticed something else. Soldiers rarely described these places with fear. The dominant emotion wasn't terror. It was unease, discomfort without threat, a sense of being out of sync. That distinction mattered. Fear demands action. Unease lingers. In some after-action discussions, younger soldiers asked whether these compounds could have been used as hide sites with underground exits, tunnels missed during clearance, advanced evasion tactics, possibly, but that still didn't explain the absence of tracks or the drone feeds, or why no one was ever caught using them before or after. The simplest answer remained the least satisfying, that something about human presence had been misread, or that presence isn't always as cleanly defined as doctrine suggests. The staff sergeant eventually left the service. He built a life that had nothing to do with patrols or compounds. But every now and then, when news footage showed abandoned buildings in conflict zones, he found himself studying the floors, the walls, the spaces where people would gather, wondering what they might feel like to the touch. The compound that was still warm no longer exists. It's been erased by time, weather, and deliberate destruction. Whatever explanation might have existed went with it. But the pattern remains. Across wars, across countries, across decades, rooms entered with confidence, only to reveal traces of something just gone, just missed, just beyond confirmation. Whether these were misinterpretations born of fatigue and stress, or the quiet residue of repeated human use pressed into physical space, no one can say for certain. What can be said is that for the people who experienced them, those moments were real, grounded, unembellished, and they stayed, like warmth in a floor, long after the fire should have gone out. Whether these were hallucinations, legends, or something else entirely, these stories have been shared for decades, and for the people who experienced them, they were very real. If you've experienced something similar, or heard accounts like this from people you trust, you're not alone. These stories rarely make it into reports, but they surface again and again in quiet conversations, years after the fact. If this account stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates grounded stories from real places and real people. Feel free to leave a comment if you've encountered something you still can't quite explain, and subscribe if you want to hear more documented accounts like this in the future. Thank you for listening.